My wife left me 3 weeks after they cracked my chest open and rebuilt my heart. And she did it for a man with a whiter smile and a newer car. And the thing she never understood, walking out that door, is that the whole comfortable life she was so sure she was keeping had only one engine. And it was the man she was leaving in the recovery chair. She thought she was trading up. Same beautiful house, same country club, same easy money, just a better-looking man to enjoy it with. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, is that none of it was a thing you inherit when you take the house. It was a thing I generated, every single day, for 31 years, by getting up before the sun and carrying a weight nobody ever saw me carry. So I did not fight her, I did not beg, I did not chase. I just stopped picking up the weight. And I let the two of them find out, slowly, what that life actually weighed when the man underneath it finally set it down. My name is Hal Brenner. I'm 64 years old. I live outside Spokane, Washington, where the pines come right down to the edge of town and the winters mean it. I built a commercial construction company called Brenner Construction out of one used truck and a set of my father's tools. And for 40 years, I put up the buildings other people get to cut ribbons in front of. If you're out there listening tonight, maybe a man who spent his life being the one everybody leans on and nobody worries about, I think you already know me a little. Stay with me to the end and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from, because the part that matters most comes after the worst part, and I want you there for it. Let me start with my father's hammer, because that's where all of it starts. My dad was a framing carpenter, not a contractor, not a businessman, a man who swung a hammer for other men his whole life and never once owned the company. When I was 17 and about to go to work, he handed me his framing hammer, a worn old Estwing with the leather grip rubbed down to almost nothing from his hand. And he told me one thing. He said, "Son, you can spend your life building other men's dreams, or you can build your own. But either way, you build things that last. Because a man is known by what he leaves standing." I have carried that hammer for 47 years. It hangs in my office now. You'll hear about it again at the end. I started Brenner Construction at 24 with that hammer, that used truck, and $4,000. I framed houses alone the first 2 years, then hired one man, then a crew. I learned the thing that built everything I have, which is that in construction, your word and your name are the whole business. If you say you'll finish by the 15th, you finish by the 15th, even if it costs you, even if you eat the overtime yourself. I ate a lot of overtime myself. I'll give you one example, because it's the whole of who I was for 40 years. In 2009, in the worst of the downturn, I had a contract to finish a medical building, and halfway through, my main supplier went under, and the steel price jumped, and the numbers turned upside down. I could have walked, the way half the contractors in town were walking that year, left the owner with a skeleton and a lawsuit, and let the lawyers sort it out. Plenty did. Instead, I finished it, on time, and I ate the loss myself. Close to $200,000 out of my own pocket, and I never said a word to the owner about what it cost me. He still doesn't know. All he knows is that Brenner finishes what Brenner starts. That building is still standing downtown, and people get good news and bad news inside it every day. And not one of them will ever know an old framer's son emptied his savings so the doors would open on time. That's what carrying looks like. It is almost always invisible, which is exactly the problem. Because a thing nobody sees is a thing people stop believing is there. By the time I was 50, Brenner Construction was the most trusted general contractor in the inland Northwest. We bonded the big jobs. The banks knew my handshake. When a developer needed a building put up right and on time, they called me. Because 40 years of never once leaving a man holding a half-finished building is a reputation you cannot buy. You can only earn it. One finished job and one swallowed loss at a time.
I met Gail when I was 32 and she was 26, and I married her a year later.
And for a long time I believed we were happy. We had one son, Danny. And here is the part I have had to be honest with myself about. Sitting in that recovery chair with a zipper of staples down my chest, I gave Gail a life. The big house up on the South Hill with the view, the club, the trips, the cars she liked to be seen in. I gave her all of it. And I told myself that giving her all of it was the same thing as loving her. And I let the giving become the whole marriage. I worked, I provided, I carried. And somewhere in all that carrying, I stopped being a husband to her and became a kind of furnace in the basement of her life. The thing that kept everything warm and that nobody thinks about until it breaks. I'm not making excuses for what she did, but I will not pretend I was a perfect man. I was a provider who forgot to also be present, and that is its own kind of failure. And I have made my peace with my half of it. What I have not made peace with, and what this story is really about, is what she did when the furnace broke. Because in the spring last year, at 63, while I was standing in a job trailer reviewing a set of prints, my left arm went numb and the room tilted. And the next clear thing I remember is a surgeon telling me they were going to have to do a quadruple bypass, that 4 of the vessels around my heart were closing, and that I'd gotten to the hospital with very little time to spare. 40 years of carrying everyone else's weight had quietly been closing the arteries around my own heart, which a poet could do something with, and which I just lived. I want to tell you about the surgery, but only the part that matters. Because while I was on that operating table, unconscious, with my chest open and a machine breathing for me, my wife was in the waiting room, and she was not praying. I know that now, because my son was sitting next to her, and Danny saw her phone. And Danny will tell you, if you ask him, exactly who his mother was texting through the longest 6 hours of my life. She was texting Rick. Let me back up and tell you who Rick was and how I learned what I learned. Because it came to me through my son. And the way it came to me is the only good thing in this whole part of the story. Danny and I had not been close. That was my doing. I was at job sites when I should have been at his ball games. And a boy remembers the empty seat, not the paycheck that bought the glove. By the time he was grown, he was polite to me and distant, the way you are with a man you respect and don't really know. He'd moved to Seattle, built his own life, and we drifted into the kind of relationship that's mostly birthdays and holidays, and a handshake that should have been a hug. But when my heart went, Danny came. He drove the 4 hours over the pass that same night, and he did not leave, not for 9 days. He slept in the vinyl chair in the recovery room that folds out into something no human can actually sleep on. He learned how to flush the surgical drains, this grown man emptying his father's wound twice a day without flinching. He shaved me when my hands still shook too bad to hold the razor. And in the long, quiet nights of that first week, the monitors beeping low, my grown son and I finally talked. Really talked. For the first time in his life. I told him I was sorry for the ball games. He told me he understood now, in a way he couldn't at 10, what it costs to carry a family, and that he forgave me, and that he just wished I'd let him in sooner. We both cried. The bad way. The way men do when something has nearly ended and they've been handed a little more time they didn't expect. I want you to understand, before I tell you the worst of it, that the worst of it happened at the exact same time as the best thing that had happened to me in 20 years. I got my son back in that room. Whatever I lost in the weeks that followed, I had already gained the thing that mattered more, and I knew it even then. It was Danny, careful and sick about it, who finally told me he'd seen the texts in the surgical waiting room, over his mother's shoulder, while I was on the table. Enough of them to understand what they were. Affectionate and easy and casual, not the messages a terrified wife sends from outside an operating room. He'd carried that alone for 2 weeks. He told me later he'd typed out the truth a dozen times on his phone in that recovery room and deleted it every time. Because, he said, "Dad, they had just rebuilt your heart, and I could not be the one who broke it again." The same week, I have thought about that a lot. My grown son sitting in a vinyl chair guarding me from the truth about my own marriage, so my new heart could get a few more days to take. But then his mother started spending her evenings out and coming home after midnight while I slept sitting up in the den. And Danny could not hold it any longer. And one morning, over coffee, he set his cup down and his hands were shaking, and he told me everything. Rick Devlin, a real estate developer. The flashy kind. The kind who shows up to a groundbreaking in a $1,000 sport coat and a hard hat that has never once had dust on it. Mid-50s, very polished, recently divorced himself, full of plans and confidence and other people's money. He built the kind of projects that look enormous on a rendering and run on financing held together with tape. Gail had met him a year before at a charity gala. The kind of event my standing in that city was what paid for us to be invited to. And somewhere across that year, while I was quietly working myself toward an operating table to keep paying for the life she lived, she had decided that the life would taste better with him in my chair. I did not hate Rick when Danny told me. That surprised me. I think some part of me, the part that builds things and can read a set of plans, looked at the situation and saw, even then, that a man like Rick is not a rival. He's a weather event. You don't hate the weather. You just find out who built their house on rock and who built theirs on a rendering. She told me 11 days after I came home from the hospital. I was in the recovery chair in the den, still sleeping, sitting up because lying flat pulled at the incision, still being woken at 3 a.m. by the strange new rhythm of my own rebuilt heart. A man relearning the most basic fact of being alive. She stood in the doorway with her coat already on and her keys already in her hand, which is how I knew the decision was not being made in that moment. It had been made a long time before, and this was just the delivery. She told me she had been unhappy for years. She told me she had spent her whole life waiting to actually start living. She told me I was not the man she married anymore, which was true and also a cruel thing to say to a man whose heart had stopped being the man she married 11 days earlier on an operating table. And she told me she deserved to be happy before it was too late. She said she'd be staying with a friend. She did not say the friend's name. She did not have to. And the thing I remember most is not anger, because I was too tired and too freshly cut open for anger. The thing I remember is that she would not look at the staples. Her eyes went everywhere in that room except the line down the center of my chest. Because a sick husband is an inconvenient thing to leave. It complicates the story a person tells herself, and it was easier for her to simply decide I was already well, to talk to me as though I were fine, as though we were two healthy people calmly going our separate ways, instead of a woman in a coat walking out on a man who still had drains in his side. I understood, watching her not look at me, that she had needed me to be fine so that she could be the kind of person who does this. And I almost felt sorry for her, because that is a very lonely thing to need. I will be fair, because I have promised myself I would tell this straight. Part of what she said was true. I had not been the man she married. I had become the furnace. There is a real grief in a marriage that quietly turns into a transaction, and some of that grief was mine to own, and I have owned it. But there is a difference between leaving a marriage and leaving a man in a recovery chair. And Gail, who is in many ways a careful and intelligent woman, chose the recovery chair on purpose. She had done the arithmetic. She believed she had me at my weakest, frightened and freshly opened up. And she believed a man like that would sign anything to make the ugliness go away quickly. Her lawyer's first letter arrived 19 days after my surgery. 19 days. It asked for the house, the cabin, half the business, and permanent support. and every line of it was written in the confident tone of a woman who is certain she has cornered a man who cannot fight back. She was right that I wasn't going to fight back. She was dead wrong about why. Because here is what happened in that recovery chair. In the long weeks while my chest knit back together and my son sat with me and my wife packed her things, I got clear. I have never in my life been as clear as I was in those weeks. And I think you only get that clear when something has actually tried to kill you. I looked at the whole structure of my life, the way I look at a building, and for the first time I saw it true. And what I saw was this. Every single thing Gail believed she was keeping, and every single thing Rick believed he was stepping into, was not a pile of money sitting in a vault. It was a current. It was a thing I generated. The house on the South Hill was beautiful, and it was also leveraged, carried on a line of credit and a payment that only made sense against my income and my discipline. The club, the cars, the cabin, the lifestyle, all of it was downstream of one man getting up every morning and choosing to carry it. The business was worth a great deal, and it was worth a great deal because of me. My name, my bonding, my 40 years of handshakes, and a man cannot be divided in a divorce. Gail thought she was dividing a fortune. What she was actually dividing was the cooling system around a furnace she had just walked away from. And I realized, sitting there, that I did not have to fight her for any of it. I just had to stop carrying what I had always carried. I had spent 31 years overextending myself, generating more than we needed, propping up a life bigger than two people honestly required. Because that was how I loved, badly, by providing. A heart only has so many beats in it, and I had been spending mine, thousands a day, holding up a roof over people who'd stopped looking up at it. Well, there was no one to provide for now who wanted me, so I could simply stop. I could let the life settle down to its true and honest weight. And the true weight of that life, without me underneath it, was going to be a great deal heavier than my wife had ever once, in 3 decades of comfort, had to notice. I'll tell you the dark stretch, because there was one, and I won't pretend there wasn't. For about a month, it looked like she'd glide right through it, and I'd be the one left with nothing. Rick was everywhere on her social media, the two of them at restaurants, at a wine thing, on the deck of his half-built luxury development with the river behind them. And she looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way she had not looked at me in a decade. And I'd sit in that recovery chair, an old man with a zipper down his chest whose wife of 31 years was toasting the sunset with a man who'd never in his life carried anything heavier than a wine glass. And I would think, maybe I'm the fool here. Maybe she really did just trade up, and I'm telling myself a story about furnaces to keep my pride warm. There were nights the grief of it sat on my rebuilt heart so heavy I'd put my hand over the incision just to make sure the thing was still going. Danny got me through those nights, mostly by not leaving. But I want you to know it was real, that stretch, that doubt. The man who tells you he was sure the whole time is lying. I was not sure. I was just patient. And patience and certainty are not the same thing. Then the settlement came, and I did the only move I had, which did not look like a move at all. We met at her lawyer's office downtown, a tense little conference room with a view of the river. Gail and her attorney on one side, me and my attorney, a sensible woman named Pat Hollis, on the other. I'd known Pat 20 years, she'd handled my contracts, and she is the kind of lawyer who would rather win quietly than loudly. Gail's lawyer laid out the demands again, line by line, the practiced indignation of a man being paid to be outraged on behalf of a client who left a heart patient in a chair. The house, the cabin, half the business, permanent support. Gail sat beside him composed and certain, a woman who had come to collect what she believed she was owed. And she still would not quite look at me, though the staples were under a shirt now and there was nothing to see. And my attorney looked at me, because we had discussed this at length, and Pat was sure I was about to make a fight of at least the business, which I could absolutely have won. I had the timeline, I had the dates, I had a son who'd seen the texts in the surgical waiting room. A meaner man with my hand would have flipped the table. I told them I agreed to almost all of it. I said Gail could have the house on the South Hill, free and clear of me. The whole thing, deed and keys, in her name alone. I watched her allow herself a small, satisfied breath. The breath of someone who has braced for a fight and been handed a gift instead. Her lawyer blinked, recalibrating. Suspicious the way men are when a thing comes too easy. And then I asked Pat to do the one thing I had asked her to prepare, which was not an attack and did not feel like one, which is exactly why it worked. It was just the truth, laid out plain, because an honest set of numbers is the most devastating thing you can put on a conference table. Pat slid across a single, clean page. Not an argument, an accounting. What the house on the South Hill actually cost to carry every month, the mortgage payment and the property taxes and the insurance and the upkeep on 8,000 square feet of view, set against the household income that had always quietly absorbed it, which was mine, and which was walking out of the marriage on my 2 feet. What the business was genuinely worth once you accounted, soberly, for the fact that its value got in a truck and drove to job sites every morning and was, by the way, 64 years old with a chest full of new plumbing. What was actually owned, which was a good deal less than the lifestyle implied, and what was actually owed, which was a good deal more. Pat did not editorialize. She read it in the flat voice of a woman reading a survey report. She just set the real arithmetic on the table. Right next to the dream arithmetic my wife had been living inside for 31 years without ever once having to open the envelope. I watched Gail read that page, and I watched the certainty drain out of her face the way light leaves a room at dusk. Not all at once, just steadily, until you look up and it's gone and you didn't see the moment it went. Because she understood, maybe for the first time in her adult life, that she had not been swimming in a reservoir she could draw a bucket from forever. She had been standing in a river, in a current, and she had just looked the current in the eye and told it to leave. She still took the house. Her pride could not do anything else by then, not in that room, not with her lawyer watching. And I let her have it, because that was the entire move. I gave her exactly what she had demanded. And what she had demanded, it turned out, was an anchor she had spent her whole life mistaking for a yacht, because she'd never once had to feel its weight. Here is what happened over the following year, and I tell it without 1 ounce of triumph, because by the time it all came true, I had stopped needing it to. I stopped carrying. That was the whole of it. I right-sized the business to something honest, let go of the over-leveraged jobs I'd only ever taken to feed a life bigger than 2 people needed. And for the first time in 40 years, I worked like a man who was also allowed to be alive. I walked every morning at the lake by my new place. I cooked actual food. I had Danny out most weekends, and we'd work on the house together. And I watched my son become my friend at 50 years too late and exactly on time. The income that had floated the South Hill house was mine alone now, and it went toward my heart and a paid-for roof and a future, instead of toward 8,000 square feet of view for a woman who'd stopped seeing me somewhere around the 2nd decade. And the life I'd stepped out from under did exactly what an unsupported structure does. It came down to its true weight. Gail had the big, beautiful house and the monthly bill that came welded to it, and no furnace in the basement to make the bill feel like nothing. Within 8 months, she was quietly listing it. And Rick, the man with the renderings, turned out to be built on the same tape and prayer he sold to his investors. His flagship development stalled the moment the financing got difficult. Because it turns out, a man who looks like money and a man who is money are 2 entirely different structures. And only one of them stays standing when the wind comes. 2 people floating on appearances do not add up to 1 person who can actually carry a thing. And the second the lifestyle Gail had assumed was permanent began to sag. Rick's devotion sagged right along with it. The way that kind of man's devotion always does. Because it was never devotion. It was an estimate. And the estimate had changed. By the time the South Hill house finally sold, at a loss, in a soft market, he had already been photographed toasting a different sunset on a different deck that belonged to someone else. I did not engineer 1 minute of that. I want to be clear about that, because it's the whole point. I did not call a single banker, pull a single string, or whisper a single word against either of them. I simply stopped holding up a life that no longer held me, and stepped out from under it, and let the most patient and honest force there is, the plain weight of things, do what I would never have lowered myself to do by hand. And here is the last move, the one underneath all the other ones, the one I want you to hear most. When the dust settled, my attorney Pat told me something I already knew but needed to hear out loud. She said, "Hal, you understand you could have buried her. You had the better lawyer, the cleaner hands, the documented timeline of when she left and why. You could have fought the support, exposed the affair, dragged it through a courtroom, and left her with a fraction of even what she got. You'd have won. Why didn't you?" And I told Pat the truth. I said, because a man who spends the back half of his life trying to make the person who hurt him suffer has let that person keep running his life from the outside. And I had just had my chest opened up to get a second one of these, and I was not going to spend it as a jailer standing guard over an old wound. I gave Gail a fair divorce. More than fair. I did not lift a hand against Rick, who frankly did the work of ruining himself without any help from me. I simply stopped holding up a life that no longer held me, and I let gravity, which is patient and honest and asks no one's permission, do the rest. That is not weakness. Refusing to become cruel when cruelty is finally within your reach and entirely deserved is the single strongest thing I have ever done. And it was a great deal harder than swinging back would have been. She came to see me about 10 months after the surgery, at my new place. I have a small house now, on a few acres east of town, paid for. Nothing to prove and nobody to prove it to. I'd been getting strong again. The cardiac rehab, the walking, the eating like a man who intends to be around. I'd lost the weight the furnace years had put on me, and I'd started sleeping lying down again, both literally and the other way. I was on the front porch I'd been building myself, board by board, my father's old hammer in my hand, when a car I recognized came slow up the gravel drive. Gail got out, and she stood by the car a moment, the way you stand when you're not sure you're welcome, which she wasn't sure of, and rightly. The certainty I'd watched leave her face in that conference room was long gone now, and so was the glow from all those sunset photographs. What was in her face instead was the thing I had spent the whole dark stretch not knowing whether I'd ever see. It was not strategy, and it was not a play for support. It was grief. The real kind, the kind that has finished arguing with itself. She told me the house had sold. She told me Rick was gone, had been gone a while. The way that kind of man is always gone, the moment the view stops being free. She told me she didn't know what she had been thinking. She said she had made a terrible mistake. And she said it the way a person says a true thing far too late, with no expectation left in it. And for 1 second, standing there in the spring light, I saw the woman I married at 26. Before the furnace and the house and the club, before either of us forgot what we were supposed to be to each other, I felt the whole 31 years move through my chest, right alongside the new heart. And I will not lie to you, it hurt, all of it, the good and the ruined both. And then I did the kindest, hard thing I know how to do, which is also the last move, the truest one, the one underneath the money and the house and all of it. I did not gloat. There was nothing in me that wanted to. And I did not punish her. Because by then I understood that the house she'd sold at a loss and the man who drifted off her had punished her more honestly and more completely than I ever could have, and without costing me a thing. But I did not open the door either. I told her, gently, and I meant it, that I forgave her. That was true. Carrying a grudge is just one more weight, and I had spent 40 years learning exactly how heavy the weights are that you choose to keep picking up. And I was done picking up that one. But I told her that forgiving her was not the same as taking her back. I told her that the man standing on this porch was a man she had decided to leave behind on purpose, at his very weakest, with the staples still in his chest, and that you do not get to come back for that man only after you've gone and checked that the better-looking option didn't hold its weight. I told her I hoped she'd be all right, and I meant that too, and then I picked my father's hammer back up off the rail, and I turned back to the porch I was building, because a board doesn't care about your history. It only cares whether your next swing is true. After a while, I heard her car go back down the drive. I did not watch it go. I had a porch to finish, and a long life, I intend, to finish it in. So here is what I'll leave you with tonight. Wherever you're listening from, they will treat you like the furnace in the basement, the thing that keeps everything warm and that nobody thinks about and that anybody can replace. They will only find out what you were worth when they leave and the cold comes in. And when that day comes, you will be tempted to make them suffer for it, and you will have every right. Don't. You don't have to burn anybody down. You just have to stop holding up a life that no longer holds you. And step out from under the weight, and let the people who never once looked down discover, on their own, exactly what they were standing on. The quiet man who finally sets the weight down is not the broken one. He's the only one who was ever really holding anything. And he is about to find out how it feels to stand up straight. If you spent your life being the one who carried it all, and somebody mistook that for something they could throw away, tell me about it down in the comments. And tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every single one. If this story was worth your time, subscribe, and take care of your own heart, both kinds. And remember that setting the weight down is not the same as giving up. Sometimes, it's the first time you've stood up straight in 40 years.